Marcus Sullivan stared at his reflection in the executive washroom mirror, adjusting his silk tie for the third time. At 52, he still cut an impressive figure, salt and pepper hair framing sharp features, and steel blue eyes that had closed countless deals across boardroom tables. 25 years of building Sullivan Financial Partners from the ground up had earned him respect in Boston's cutthroat financial district. But lately, something felt off. "Another late night, boss?" Tom Chen, his VP of operations, emerged from a stall, straightening his own tie. "Sarah's going to start wondering if you've got a secret girlfriend." He chuckled, but there was something in his tone that made Marcus's neck prickle. "Just wrapping up the Westbrook merger," Marcus replied, studying Tom's reflection. They'd worked together for 15 years, climbing the corporate ladder side by side. Tom had been best man at his wedding to Rachel, godfather to their daughter Emma. But lately, his oldest friend seemed different. Distracted. Almost smug. "Rachel understands. She knows what it takes to build something like this." Marcus's voice carried more conviction than he felt. The truth was, things with Rachel had been strained for months. The passionate discussions over wine about their dreams, the spontaneous weekend getaways, the simple joy of sharing morning coffee, all had gradually faded into polite conversations about Emma's college applications and household logistics. Back in his corner office, Marcus found himself staring at the family photo on his desk. Rachel's smile seemed forced, her green eyes lacking their usual sparkle. Emma, their 17-year-old daughter, stood between them, her face bearing that typical teenage mixture of embarrassment and affection. The picture was taken at the vineyard last summer, before the subtle shifts began. His phone buzzed, a text from Rachel, "Don't forget dinner with the Hendersons tonight." 7:30. Marcus had completely forgotten. James Henderson was a potential major investor, and Rachel had been planning this dinner for weeks. He quickly texted back, "Of course. Looking forward to it." The day proceeded normally until late afternoon, when Marcus's assistant Clara knocked on his door. Her face was pale. "Mr. Sullivan. There's something you should see." She handed him a manila envelope, unmarked except for his name typed in bold letters. Inside, Marcus found photographs. His hand trembled as he flipped through them. Rachel, entering the Four Seasons. Rachel, intimate with a man in what appeared to be a hotel room. The man's face wasn't visible in most shots, but in one, he turned toward the camera. Marcus's blood ran cold. It was James Henderson. The photos spanned months, based on Rachel's changing outfits and the seasonal changes visible through windows. Each image felt like a physical blow, but it was the last item in the envelope that truly gutted him, a USB drive containing security camera footage from their own home, showing Rachel letting Henderson in through the back door on days Marcus worked late. His office phone rang, Rachel's number. Marcus stared at it, his mind racing. The Westbrook merger delays, Henderson's sudden interest in investing, Tom's strange behavior, Clara's worried glances, pieces of a puzzle he hadn't known he was solving began clicking into place. The phone kept ringing as Marcus opened his laptop and began checking financial records. What he found made his hands shake harder, a pattern of suspicious transfers, consulting fees to shell companies, and irregularities that suggested something far more sinister than just an affair. Rachel wasn't just sleeping with Henderson. They were systematically undermining everything Marcus had built. The phone stopped ringing. A text appeared, "Don't forget, 7:30. James is bringing the contracts." Marcus looked at the family photo again, seeing it with new eyes. Behind Rachel's strained smile and Emma's teenage awkwardness lay a web of betrayal he was only beginning to unravel. He picked up his phone and made a call to someone he hadn't spoken to in years, Michael Reeves, his old college roommate who now worked for the FBI's white-collar crime division. "Mike? It's Marcus Sullivan. Remember that favor you owe me? I need your help. But first, I have to attend a dinner party." As the sun set over Boston's skyline, Marcus straightened his tie one final time. Tonight's dinner would proceed exactly as planned, but not for the reasons Rachel and Henderson expected. After 25 years of building his empire, Marcus Sullivan was about to learn that some things needed to be broken before they could be rebuilt. He slipped the envelope into his briefcase, grabbed his coat, and headed for the elevator. The game was about to change, and Marcus intended to play it all the way to the end, no matter the cost. The Sullivan home stood illuminated against the darkening sky, a Georgian colonial that had graced Beacon Hill for over a century. Marcus sat in his car, watching Rachel move gracefully behind the windows as she prepared for their guests. Even now, knowing what he knew, the sight of her still made his heart ache. 23 years of marriage played through his mind like a fever dream. Their first date at that tiny Italian restaurant in the North End. The way she'd laughed when he proposed on the Charles River Esplanade, the ring nearly falling into the water. Emma's birth, Rachel squeezing his hand so tight he thought it would break. Thousands of small moments that had shaped their life together, or what he'd thought their life was. His phone buzzed. A text from Michael at the FBI, teams in position. Remember, let them make the first move. We need concrete evidence. Marcus entered through the front door, the familiar scent of Rachel's signature Coke au vin filling the air. She appeared from the kitchen, wearing the black dress he'd given her for their anniversary. Her smile faltered slightly when she saw his expression. "You're late," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "James and Patricia will be here any minute." "Traffic," Marcus replied, studying her face. How many times had she kissed him goodbye while harboring such secrets? How many nights had she laid beside him, planning his destruction? The doorbell rang. Rachel moved to answer it, but Marcus stepped in front of her. "Allow me," he said, opening the door to reveal James Henderson and his wife Patricia. James, silver-haired and distinguished in his tailored suit, extended his hand. Marcus took it, noting the expensive watch on Henderson's wrist, the same one visible in several of the photos. "Marcus. Good to see you," Henderson boomed. "Patricia and I have been looking forward to this all week." Patricia Henderson was a wisp of a woman who seemed to fade into the background, exactly the kind of wife a man like Henderson would choose, Marcus realized. Someone who wouldn't ask questions about late nights or suspicious meetings. Dinner proceeded like a play where everyone knew their lines except Marcus. Rachel served her perfect meal while Henderson discussed the merger's potential. Patricia made polite comments about the wine. It was all so normal, so practiced, that Marcus almost doubted the evidence in his briefcase. Then Henderson brought out the contracts. "I think you'll find everything in order," Henderson said, sliding the thick document across the table. "Just a few signatures and we can take Sullivan Financial to the next level." Marcus picked up the contract, pretending to read while Rachel and Henderson exchanged glances they thought he wouldn't notice. He turned to page 47, exactly where Michael had told him to look. "Interesting structure here," Marcus said carefully. "The subsidiary holdings transfer to an offshore trust before the merger completes. Quite innovative." Henderson's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Standard procedure these days. Helps with tax efficiency. And these consulting fees?" Marcus continued, his voice steady despite his racing heart. $5 million to global strategic partners." He turned to Rachel. "Isn't that the firm your old college friend runs? The one you've been meeting at the Four Seasons?" The color drained from Rachel's face. Henderson's hand tightened around his wine glass. "I don't know what you're implying," Henderson started, but Marcus was already reaching for his briefcase. "Let me show you exactly what I'm implying." He spread the photographs across the table like playing cards. Patricia Henderson gasped. Rachel's wine glass slipped from her hand, shattering on the hardwood floor. "Did you really think I wouldn't find out?" Marcus's voice was quiet, controlled. "The affair was just the beginning, wasn't it? You've been systematically draining my company for months. Those merger delays. Orchestrated to drive down our stock price. The shell companies. All leading back to accounts you control. Henderson stood abruptly. This is absurd. Patricia, we're leaving. Sit down, James, Marcus commanded. The FBI agents outside might have questions about your early departure. Rachel's face crumpled. Marcus, please. You don't understand. He threatened Emma. The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. What? Show him, Rachel whispered to Henderson, who had gone deathly pale. Henderson slowly reached for his phone, hands shaking as he pulled up a series of messages. What Marcus read made his blood run cold: detailed threats against their daughter, surveillance photos of Emma at college, explicit descriptions of what would happen if Rachel didn't cooperate. The pieces shifted again in Marcus's mind, forming a new picture. Rachel's strained smiles. Her insistence that Emma stay on campus during breaks. The silent tears he'd sometimes heard at night, which she'd blamed on menopause. How long? Marcus asked her. 8 months, Rachel whispered. Since Henderson's partner discovered irregularities in the pension fund. They needed a way to hide the losses. Our company was perfect, successful enough to absorb the debt, vulnerable enough to manipulate. She looked at him with tears streaming down her face. I couldn't tell you. They were watching Emma. Every time I tried to warn you, they sent new photos of her. The front door burst open as FBI agents flooded in. Henderson lunged for his phone, but Marcus was faster, grabbing his wrist. The messages stay, he growled. Evidence of what you did to my family. As Henderson was led away in handcuffs, Patricia collapsed into tears, revealing she'd suspected her husband's criminal activities for years but had been too afraid to speak up. Rachel stood trembling in their ruined dining room, wine seeping into the antique rug like blood. I wanted to protect her, she whispered. I thought I could handle it alone. I thought. She broke down completely. Marcus watched the woman he'd loved for half his life crumble before him, and realized that while one mystery was solved, a harder question remained: how do you rebuild trust from ashes? His phone buzzed again, Emma calling from college. Probably wondering why FBI agents had just detained her stalkers. Marcus took a deep breath, looking at Rachel. We'll tell her together, he said quietly. No more secrets in this family. The night wasn't over. There would be statements to give, charges to file, a company to save, and a marriage to either rebuild or lay to rest. But as Marcus reached for his daughter's call, he knew one thing with certainty: sometimes the deepest betrayals hide the most desperate acts of love. Emma Sullivan sat in her father's home office, her laptop open to a video call where her mother's tear-stained face filled the screen. The morning sun cast prismatic shadows through the beveled windows, fragmenting across the antique desk where Marcus sat beside his daughter, his hand resting protectively near hers. They were following me for months, Emma whispered, her voice trembling as she scrolled through the surveillance photos the FBI had recovered. That guy who kept showing up at campus coffee shops, the maintenance worker who was always around my dorm. She looked up at her father, then back at Rachel's image. Why didn't you tell me? Because I was afraid, Rachel's voice cracked. Henderson's people made it clear, if I warned you or your father, they'd. She couldn't finish the sentence. Marcus watched his daughter process this information, seeing shadows of both himself and Rachel in her features as she fought to maintain composure. At 17, Emma had already inherited her mother's quiet strength and his analytical mind. Now she was being forced to use both to understand how her world had imploded. The FBI agent says they'll need my statement, Emma continued, her voice steadying. About the stalking, the mysterious accidents that kept happening around me. She paused, looking directly at her mother. The brake lines on my car didn't just wear out naturally, did they? Rachel's sob was answer enough. Marcus felt his daughter's hand begin to shake under his, and he squeezed it gently. The previous night's revelations had been just the beginning. Each hour brought new discoveries, new depths to Henderson's manipulation of their lives. The investigation was spreading like wildfire through Boston's financial district. Tom Chen had been arrested that morning, caught trying to delete servers full of evidence. Other board members were lawyering up, and Sullivan Financial stock was in freefall. But here in his home office, watching his daughter comfort her mother through a screen while processing her own trauma, Marcus knew the real damage wasn't financial. "I've been looking at old photos," Emma said suddenly, pulling up images on her phone. "Trying to figure out when it all started. Mom, remember my graduation? You wouldn't let anyone take pictures of us together. You kept finding reasons to step away." She swiped through more photos. "And Christmas break, when you insisted I stay on campus to focus on my studies, you were protecting me, weren't you?" Rachel nodded, unable to speak. Marcus found himself studying the same photos, seeing what he'd missed. The subtle distance Rachel had maintained, not from lack of love, but from desperate protection. The way she'd positioned herself in groups, always keeping herself between Emma and certain people. A mother's instinct to shield, even at the cost of her daughter's trust. "The pension fund fraud goes back 3 years, Marcus said quietly. Henderson and his partners had been embezzling millions, using sophisticated algorithms to hide the losses. When they needed a company to absorb their debt, they didn't just choose us randomly." He looked at Rachel. "They chose us because of you." Rachel's hands covered her face. "Henderson knew me from charity boards. He knew I handled the household finances, that I'd notice any irregularities in our accounts. So they made sure I couldn't speak up." Her voice hardened. "But I didn't just submit. I kept records. Every meeting, every threat, every transaction. I hid it all where they'd never look." Emma leaned forward. "The recipe box. The one with Grandma's old cards." A ghost of a smile crossed Rachel's face. "Behind the cards. USB drives, account numbers, dates. I encrypted everything using your old computer games as passwords. Things only our family would know." Marcus felt a sudden surge of pride mixed with pain. While he'd been looking for betrayal, Rachel had been documenting evidence. While he'd suspected affair, she'd been playing a desperate game of chess with their daughter's life as stakes. His phone buzzed, "Michael from the FBI again. Marcus, we found something in Henderson's offshore accounts. You and Rachel need to see this immediately." Emma closed her laptop, her face set with determination. "I'm coming with you. Both of you." "Emma, honey, it's not safe." Rachel started. "I'm already involved," Emma cut her off. "They made me involved the moment they started stalking me. I deserve to know everything." She stood, looking so much like Rachel in her moments of unshakable resolve that Marcus's chest ached. "We face this as a family." Rachel's eyes met Marcus's through the screen, a silent question passing between them. He nodded slowly. Their daughter had been forced to grow up overnight, but perhaps that same crucible of crisis that threatened to break them could also forge them into something stronger. "I'll be there in 30 minutes, Rachel said. "Don't start without me." As Emma went to change, Marcus stared at the family photos on his desk. Behind each smile lay a story of sacrifice he was only beginning to understand. Henderson had tried to use their love as a weapon against them. Now, perhaps, it could become their shield. His phone buzzed again, an encrypted message from Michael. "You won't believe what we found in Henderson's private server. The conspiracy goes higher than we thought. Much higher." Marcus looked up as Emma returned, car keys in hand. She'd changed into a simple black dress that made her look older, more determined. "Ready for war. Let's go get Mom," she said simply. "I think it's time we show them what happens when you threaten a Sullivan." The FBI's temporary command center hummed with activity as Rachel Sullivan stood before a wall of evidence, her hands steady as she pointed out connections that had eluded even the federal investigators. Marcus and Emma sat nearby, watching her transform from a victim into something else entirely, a warrior who had been fighting silently all along. Henderson's threats weren't just about money, Rachel explained, her voice growing stronger with each word. The pension fund fraud was only part of it. Look here. She indicated a complex web of transactions on the screen. These shell companies. They're not just hiding stolen money. They're moving something else. Something darker. Michael Reeves leaned forward, his FBI badge catching the fluorescent light. Human trafficking, he said quietly. Henderson's organization was using legitimate businesses as fronts. Your company would have given them access to international banking channels, making their operations nearly untraceable. Emma's hand found her mother's, squeezing tight. That's why you couldn't just run, she whispered. You knew what they were really doing. Rachel's composure cracked slightly. I found out 3 months ago. One of Henderson's associates got drunk at a charity gala, started bragging about their import-export business. I did some digging and... She took a shuddering breath. I couldn't just walk away. Not when I knew there were other daughters out there, other families being threatened. Marcus felt something shift in his chest as he watched his wife, this woman he thought he'd lost to betrayal, reveal the true depths of her courage. She hadn't just been protecting their family, she'd been gathering evidence to protect countless others. The recipe box, Emma said suddenly. Show them what else was in it. Rachel nodded, pulling out a small USB drive. I started encoding GPS coordinates into my grocery lists. Every time Henderson or his people met with someone, I found ways to be there. Recording. Documenting. Her voice hardened. I learned to hide cameras in my jewelry, to plant listening devices in my own home during their business meetings. I became what they least expected, a threat hidden in plain sight. As the FBI techs began downloading the drive's contents, Marcus moved to stand beside his wife. Why didn't you come to me? He asked softly, not accusing now, but trying to understand. Rachel's eyes met his, brimming with unshed tears. Because you would have tried to fight them head-on. They would have killed you, taken Emma, and continued hurting other families. She touched his face gently. I couldn't risk losing you both. So I became someone else. Someone who could play their game long enough to bring them down. The computer screens suddenly lit up with new data. Photos, videos, audio recordings, all meticulously catalogued and cross-referenced. Rachel had created a detailed map of Henderson's entire operation, including connections to prominent figures in politics, finance, and law enforcement. My God, Michael breathed, staring at the evidence. This goes all the way to the State House. Senator Morrison's charity foundation, it's been laundering money for them for years. Emma stood up, her young face fierce with pride and determination. Mom wasn't just surviving, she said. She was building a case. Every time they thought they were controlling her, she was really recording everything. Marcus finished, his voice thick with emotion. Every threat, every crime, every connection. He turned to Rachel, seeing her through new eyes. You weren't broken. You were biding your time. Rachel's professional facade cracked completely then, and she leaned into Marcus's embrace. I thought I'd lost you both, she whispered. Every time I had to meet him, every time I couldn't explain. I was so afraid you'd never understand. Emma joined their embrace, forming a circle of healing in the midst of the bustling command center. We understand now, she said firmly. And we're not letting you fight alone anymore. A commotion at the door interrupted their moment. Senator Morrison had just been taken into custody, and Henderson was demanding to speak with Rachel. He says he has one more card to play, Michael reported grimly. Something about evidence he's kept as insurance. Rachel straightened, wiping her tears. Let me talk to him. When Marcus started to protest, she held up her hand. I've been handling him for months. I know how to make him reveal things he doesn't mean to show. Not alone, Emma said firmly. Never alone again. Marcus nodded, his protective instincts warring with his new understanding of his wife's strength. We go together. As a family. Rachel looked between them, her daughter's unflinching support, her husband's dawning understanding, and felt something like hope begin to bloom in her chest. Together, she agreed. But first, there's something else in that recipe box you need to see. Something I've been saving for exactly this moment. She pulled out one final USB drive, smaller than the others. Henderson's not the only one who kept insurance. And mine is much more dangerous to them than anything he could have saved. As Rachel led them back to the evidence room, Marcus watched her transformed posture, no longer a victim pretending to be strong, but a warrior finally able to show her true strength. They had all been broken by this experience, but as they moved forward together, he realized that some things, like trust and love, could be rebuilt stronger at their broken places. The next confrontation with Henderson awaited, but for the first time, Marcus wasn't afraid. His family had been forged in fire, and they were ready to face whatever came next, not as individuals trying to protect each other, but as a united front, stronger together than they'd ever been apart. The interrogation room at the FBI field office felt smaller than Rachel remembered from her previous visits to give statements. This time, though, she wasn't alone. Marcus sat beside her, their shoulders touching, while Emma watched through the two-way mirror with Michael's team. The physical proximity of her family gave Rachel a strength she hadn't allowed herself to feel during the long months of silent resistance. James Henderson sat across from them, his expensive suit wrinkled from a night in custody, his typical smooth confidence replaced by something more desperate. His eyes kept darting between Rachel and Marcus, searching for cracks in their united front. "You don't understand what you've done," Henderson began, his voice hoarse. "The people I answer to, they won't just let this end with me. They'll burn everything down. Your company, your reputation, your family's future." Rachel felt Marcus tense beside her but kept her own expression neutral. She'd learned to read Henderson's tells during their forced interactions, the slight tremor in his left hand when he was bluffing, the way he overcompensated with threats when he felt cornered. "Actually, James," Rachel said quietly, removing her necklace, the one she'd worn to every meeting with him for the past 8 months, "I understand perfectly." She placed the pendant on the table between them. "Do you know what this is?" Henderson stared at the jewelry with confusion. "A family heirloom, you said." "Your grandmother's." "It's a recording device," Rachel corrected him. "One of many I've had on me every time we met. Including the night you first threatened Emma." She leaned forward, her voice steady. "I have everything, James. Every threat. Every admission. Every name you let slip when you thought you were in control." The color drained from Henderson's face. "You're bluffing. You were too scared to dash. To fight back." Rachel's laugh held no humor. "Fear doesn't make people powerless, James. Sometimes it makes them dangerous. You threatened my daughter. Did you really think that would make me weaker?" Marcus reached under the table and squeezed her hand, a gesture of support that brought unexpected tears to her eyes. For months, she'd carried the weight of her secret resistance alone. Now, feeling her husband's strength beside her, Rachel finally allowed herself to acknowledge the toll it had taken. "The offshore accounts," Henderson tried again. "The evidence I have about Marcus's involvement is fabricated," Marcus cut in. "We already found the server where you stored the doctored documents. Did you really think Rachel wouldn't tell me everything once she was sure Emma was safe? That we wouldn't work together to unravel your entire operation?" Emma's voice came through the intercom, steady and clear. "Show him the recipe box files, Mom." Rachel pulled out her phone, pulling up documents she'd gathered over months of careful surveillance. "Your organization didn't just target our family, did they? There were others. The Brightons in Chicago. The Mendoza family in Miami. All carefully chosen, successful enough to be useful, vulnerable enough to be controlled through their children. Henderson's composure cracked further. You don't have proof of dash. I have everything, Rachel interrupted. Every meeting with Senator Morrison about the trafficking routes. Your conversations with Judge Patterson about burying evidence. The money transfers to offshore accounts belonging to Assistant Director Clark's shell companies. She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. I documented everything, James. While you thought you were destroying my family, I was building a case that will bring down your entire network. Marcus watched his wife with a mixture of awe and profound regret for ever doubting her. The strength it must have taken to maintain her facade while gathering evidence, to endure his suspicion while protecting their daughter, to fight a battle none of them had known was raging, it was staggering. Why are you telling me this? Henderson asked, his voice barely a whisper. Because I want you to understand, Rachel replied, her voice gentle but implacable. You didn't break me. You didn't break us. Every time you thought you were tightening your control, you were actually teaching me how to be stronger. How to fight smarter. How to protect not just my family, but all the other families you targeted. Emma entered the room then, moving to stand behind her parents. Her presence completed something in Rachel, a circuit of strength that had been building since that first terrible threat against her daughter. The thing about glass, James, Rachel continued, is that when it breaks, it can become something else. Something sharper. More dangerous. She stood, her family rising with her. You tried to shatter us. Instead, you gave us edges. Henderson's last attempt at bravado crumbled as he looked at the unified family before him. What do you want? Names, Rachel said simply. Every contact, every conspirator, every person who helped target innocent families. You're going to give them to us, and then you're going to testify against them all. They'll kill me, Henderson whispered. Then you better hope the evidence I've gathered is enough to put them away for good, Rachel replied. Because right now, I'm the only chance you have of surviving what's coming. As they left Henderson to consider his options, Marcus pulled Rachel into his arms, holding her with a tenderness that spoke of newfound understanding. Emma joined their embrace, and for a moment, they stood together in silence, absorbing the reality of their survival. I need to show you both something, Rachel said finally, wiping tears from her eyes. The last piece of evidence. The one that explains why Henderson was so desperate to control our family specifically. She led them toward the evidence room, her steps lighter now that she no longer carried her burden alone. The truth that awaited them would change everything again, but this time, they would face it together, stronger for having been broken and reformed in the crucible of their trial. The evidence room had grown quiet, the bustling activity of the FBI investigation muted by the weight of what Rachel was about to reveal. She stood before the old recipe box, her fingers trailing over its worn edges with a gentleness that spoke of years of careful preservation. Marcus and Emma waited beside her, their presence both comforting and strengthening. Before I show you this, Rachel began softly, I need you both to understand something. What happened to our family, it wasn't random. Henderson didn't choose us just because of the company's financial position. She took a deep breath, steeling herself. He chose us because of what Marcus's father did 30 years ago. Marcus felt his world tilt slightly. My father? But he died before. Before you built the company, yes, Rachel finished. But not before he discovered something about Henderson's mentor, Richard Blackwood. She carefully opened the recipe box, removing a false bottom to reveal a yellowed envelope. Your father didn't die in a car accident, Marcus. He was silenced. The revelation hung in the air like smoke, thick and choking. Emma moved closer to her father, taking his hand as Rachel continued. I found these while going through your mother's things after she passed last year, Rachel explained, her voice gentle. Letters your father wrote, documenting everything he'd uncovered about Blackwood's trafficking operation. He'd been building a case, working with the FBI. She looked at Marcus with eyes full of understanding pain. The same unit Michael runs now. Marcus's free hand trembled as he reached for the letters. His father's familiar handwriting filled page after page, detailing a conspiracy that had spanned decades. He knew, Marcus whispered. He knew, and he tried to stop them. And they killed him for it, Rachel confirmed softly. When Henderson approached me, when he started making threats, I recognized the pattern. It was all there in your father's letters, the same methods, the same gradual takeover of vulnerable families. That's why I couldn't just run. I had to finish what your father started. Emma's voice broke the heavy silence. That's why you taught me all those weird safety protocols growing up. The emergency codes, the secure communication methods, you were preparing, weren't you, Mom? You knew they might come for us someday. Rachel nodded, tears streaming freely now. I promised your grandmother I'd protect you both. She told me everything before she died, made me understand what we might face. So I learned. I planned. I became what they never expected, a survivor who knew their playbook before they even made their move. Marcus stared at his wife with new understanding. All those years of what he'd thought was just Rachel's excessive caution, the self-defense classes she'd insisted Emma take, the cybersecurity measures she'd implemented at home, the careful documentation of their lives, had been preparation for this battle. When Henderson threatened Emma, Rachel continued, I knew I couldn't let history repeat itself. Your father died trying to protect you, Marcus. I chose to live to protect our daughter. Every compromise, every moment of letting you believe the worst of me, it was all to keep his sacrifice from being in vain. The depth of Rachel's love and dedication hit Marcus like a physical force. She had carried not only the weight of their immediate crisis but the legacy of his father's unfinished fight. While he'd been building his company, she'd been building a fortress around their family, preparing for a war she prayed would never come. The recipe box, Emma said suddenly, understanding dawning in her eyes. All those times you taught me to bake, having me memorize the special family recipes, you were teaching me survival codes, weren't you? Every ingredient list was actually emergency protocols, Rachel finished. Ways to contact help, locations of safe houses, methods to access emergency funds. I needed you to know them so deeply you'd never forget, but in a way that wouldn't raise suspicion if anyone went through our things. Marcus found himself looking at the familiar recipe cards with new eyes. Each carefully penned instruction was actually a key to survival, love disguised as routine, protection hidden in plain sight. Show them the final piece, Michael said from the doorway, having silently joined them. Rachel nodded, pulling out one last document from the recipe box. Your father didn't just document the crimes, Marcus. He created a trust, hidden so deep even Blackwood never found it. Money that's been gathering interest for 30 years, designated for one purpose, helping the families their organization targeted rebuild their lives. The implications were staggering. Not only had Rachel protected their family, but she'd also positioned them to help others escape the same web of exploitation and control. That's why I had to play their game long enough to gather everything, Rachel explained. It wasn't just about us anymore. Your father left us a legacy of protection, and I had to honor that. Emma moved to embrace her mother, her young face wet with tears but filled with fierce pride. You're the strongest person I've ever known, she whispered. Marcus joined them, enfolding both his wife and daughter in his arms. In the soft light of the evidence room, surrounded by the proof of decades of love and protection, their family bond felt stronger than ever, not despite the trials they'd faced, but because of how they'd faced them together. What happens now? Emma asked softly. Rachel looked at her family, then at the evidence they'd gathered together. Now we do what the Sullivans have always done, we protect others. We help them rebuild. We turn our scars into shields for those who need shelter. As they left the FBI building that evening, the setting sun caught the beveled glass windows, creating a cascade of rainbow light. Marcus watched it play across his family's faces and realized that sometimes the most beautiful things come from broken pieces, reformed into something stronger, more complex, and infinitely more precious than before. Their story wasn't over, there would be trials to face, testimonies to give, other families to help. But they would face it all together, their bond forged stronger in the crucible of their trial, their love deeper for having been tested. They had emerged not just survivors, but warriors for others who needed the kind of protection Rachel had so carefully built around their own family. In the end, Henderson had failed to understand the most fundamental truth: some things, when broken, don't shatter, they transform. And in that transformation, they become unbreakable.